I want to be clear about something before I start. I have told this story exactly once to my brother-in-law Ray over a kitchen table in Welch last spring, and he sat there the whole time without saying a word, except at the end when he asked if I still went back up there. I told him no. He nodded like he already knew the answer. That was the first time I had said any of it out loud, and even then I left parts out because I was not sure he would stay at the table if I put all of it in. What I am doing now is putting all of it in. My name is Wade. I am 47 years old. I spent 17 years working underground for a mining operation in McDowell County, West Virginia, starting when I was 22 and finishing when the operation closed in 2016 and left about 400 of us looking at each other in a parking lot. I know what the dark looks like when there is no light source within a mile of you. I know what it feels like to be in a place the human body was not designed to be in. I grew up in that county. I hunted it from the time I was 12. And I've never been the kind of man who puts stock in the stories people tell around fires. There are things in those mountains that people have been dressing up in folklore for a long time, and most of those things are a bear or a bobcat or their own fear getting ahead of them. I believed that with my whole chest for 44 years. This happened in November of 2019. It was the second week of rifle deer season, which in West Virginia opens around the middle of the month. And Denny Pruitt and I had been hunting together every November since we were in our early 30s. Denny was 51 that year, stocky, with a gray beard he kept trimmed, and a habit of chewing the same piece of gum for what seemed like hours before he finally swallowed it. He was the kind of hunter who moved slowly and thought about where he was putting his feet before he put them there. He had been hunting McDowell County longer than I had, and he did not spook easily. That matters for what I'm going to tell you. We were going into Buckhorn Hollow, off Route 10, about a 12-mile drive southeast of Welch. The hollow sits at roughly 2,100 feet and runs back between two ridge lines that close up on each other as you go in, so by the time you are a mile from the road, the walls of the ridges are right there on both sides of you, heavy with rhododendron and mountain laurel so thick in places you cannot push through it without a machete. There is a gravel access road that used to service a small mining operation, long closed, and it runs about a mile and a half in before it ends at a flat area where the equipment yard used to be. That flat patch is where we set up camp. We had been in there the year before and seen good deer sign, a couple of nice scrapes along the creek drainage, and Denny had almost put a tag on a 6-point on the last morning. So we went back. We drove in on a Monday before first light, the 15th of November, with Denny's truck loaded with a wall tent, a small propane heater, our gear bags, and enough food for 4 days. It was cold, in the low 20s when we left Welch, and the ground was frozen hard enough that our boots made a sound on it. The sky was clear. You could see every star there is from down in those hollows when the cloud cover is off, and that morning was as clear as glass. We got camp set up by about 6:30 and ate out of the tent and split off toward our separate stands before the light fully arrived. There was nothing wrong with that morning. There was nothing wrong with that day. I want to be plain about that because the wrongness came later, and it came slowly in the ordinary hours before it mattered. The deer sign was good. I found a fresh scrape on a poplar about 100 yards up the ridge from where I was sitting, and I watched a doe, and 2 yearlings crossed the creek drainage below me around 9 in the morning. I did not shoot. We were both holding for a buck, something at least 3 years old. Denny radioed at noon to say he had seen nothing, but wanted to move his stand 200 yards north into a saddle he had been thinking about. I told him to do it. We met back at camp around 3 in the afternoon for coffee and a late lunch, and Denny seemed settled, the way he always did after a good morning in the woods. He had found where a deer had been bedding in a stand of hemlocks. He was pleased about that. That evening is when the first thing happened. We were walking back toward camp in the last of the light, coming down the access road side by side, when Denny stopped. Not gradually the way a man stops when something catches his eye. He stopped the way a dog stops, all at once. Weight shifted back. I was a step behind him and nearly walked into him. There was sound coming from the laurel thicket that runs along the west side of the hollow, maybe 60 yards off the road. It was a crashing, heavy sound, the kind that does not belong to anything small. A sustained movement through the brush, not a bound or a scramble, more like something displacing the laurel systematically, shoulder width or wider, moving parallel to us. Denny said quietly, "That is a big bear." I listened to it for another few seconds. The sound did not stop. Whatever was in the thicket kept moving, and it moved for a long time before it went quiet. I had a thought that I put aside quickly, a thought about the width of the path that sound implied. But I put it aside. Denny had said it was a bear, and Denny had 40 years in these woods, and he was probably right. "It's moving away," I said. "Yeah," he said. He stood there another moment. Then he started walking again. Neither of us talked much at dinner that night. I want to say something about the hollow at night before I go further. During deer season, you are in your sleeping bag early because you are up at 4:30 and in a wall tent with a propane heater. The nights are actually comfortable in a way that good cold camping always is. But Buckhorn Hollow at night has a specific quality that I noticed the first time we went in and noticed again that year. It is quiet in a way that hollows in that county are generally not. There are always sounds in the mountains at night. Not loud ones, but there is always something moving, always a creek making its noise over rocks, always wind working through the ridges at some register. In Buckhorn, the quiet has a density to it. I noticed it the first time and filed it away as a feature of the geography, the way the ridges close in, the way the laurel absorbs sound. I thought I had an explanation. I woke up at 2 a.m. I know the time because I had my watch on the tent frame where I could see the face, and I reached up and looked at it the way you do when you wake in a strange darkness and need to orient yourself. 2:04 in the morning, November 16th. The propane heater had cycled down. Denny was a quiet sleeper, and I could not hear him across the tent. I could not hear anything at all. I lay there and let that register. No creek. I knew there was a creek 20 yards from the tent. I had heard it when I went to sleep. Water moving over the flat rocks in the drainage. A sound I knew well from 30 years of hunting in hollow country. And it was gone. The whole hollow was gone. There was no insect noise, no small animals working the leaf litter, no wind in the laurel, no owl, nothing. It was the kind of silence that has mass that sits on you. I told myself the cold had quieted things down, that on a still night below freezing, sometimes the insects simply weren't active, and the creek had a skin of ice on it now. Those were reasonable explanations, and I applied them, and I went back to sleep. I did not sleep well for the rest of the night. In the morning, Denny was up before me, already at the propane stove outside, when I came out of the tent with my coffee thermos. Gray light, maybe 6:15. The trees still dark against a pale sky. He was looking down toward the creek, and he had his coffee in his hand, and he had not put it to his mouth. "Come look at this," he said. I went down with him to the creek drainage. About 40 yards from the tent, in a flat area where the creek had deposited some gravel in a bend, there was a deer carcass, a white-tailed doe, and she hadn't been dead long, maybe overnight. What stopped me was the way she was positioned. She was laid out perpendicular to the creek on her side, hindquarters toward the water, and her head pointing into the brush. Her rib cage was open, and the internal cavity had been cleared out in a specific way, not the way coyotes or bear work a carcass. The hide was not torn, the legs were intact. The head was intact. Something had opened the body in a deliberate channel from the sternum down and removed what it wanted. Around the carcass, the gravel was clean. There were no tracks I could identify, not in the frozen gravel, and the creek bank on the far side was frozen too hard for prints. Denny looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Cougar, maybe, or a bear that's had practice. There are mountain lions in West Virginia, in very low numbers, unconfirmed by the Wildlife Commission, but not impossible." I turned that explanation over. The cavity work was not right for a cat, in my experience. Mountain lions, Cash, they cover, they work from the neck, This animal had been processed, almost. I did not say that to Denny. I said probably. "Let's get on stand." He nodded. He took one more look at the carcass. If you have ever spent time in the woods and had that particular feeling where a piece of evidence is in front of you, and every explanation you run against it quietly fails. You know what was happening in my chest that morning. You know how a man pushes that down because there is a practical morning ahead of him and a deer tag in his pocket and 30 years of competence that tells him there is always an explanation. I'm saying this now because I want you to understand that I tried. I tried every rational door I knew, and the carcass stood there in the creek bed and stayed wrong. I was in my stand by 7:30 that morning up on the East Ridge, about 3/4 of a mile from camp. The stand was a climber I had put into a white oak maybe 30 feet up, overlooking a bench where the trail showed good traffic. The morning passed without incident. No deer movement to speak of, just chickadees working the bark of a birch to my north, and a red-tailed hawk making wide circles over the ridge. I ate a granola bar around 10. I glassed the far ridge line with my binoculars every 20 or 30 minutes, the way I always do. At about 2 in the afternoon, I was glassing the ridge line to the west when I saw something at the tree line near the top of the ridge. My first thought was that it was a large man standing at the tree line, mostly inside the shadows of the timber, but with its upper body catching the dull gray light. The silhouette was upright, 2 legs wide at the shoulder, the head above the shoulders in the way a human head sits. My brain went immediately to trespasser, poacher, someone I didn't want in my hunting area. I kept the binoculars on it. The scale was wrong. I had a reference point. There was a dead snag at the edge of the tree line, a tulip poplar that had come down to about a 45-degree angle, and I had noted it when I set up my stand because it was a landmark on the ridge. I knew approximately how tall that snag was because I had looked at it across the hollow for 2 days. The figure standing at the tree line was taller than the upright portion of that snag. It was standing still, not the stillness of a man pausing to look around, but the specific, fixed stillness of something that has been standing there for a while and is in no hurry to move. I sat with the binoculars on it for what felt like a minute, maybe 2 minutes. The figure did not move. I looked away to check my footing on the stand platform, looked back, and it was gone. Not moved, not walked away in the time I was looking down. Gone. The tree line was empty. I spent the next hour on that stand with my heart running faster than it should have been and my eyes going back to that ridge line every few minutes. The light started to drop around 4. I made the decision to come down and walk back to camp while I could still see. That was not a decision I made lightly. I had driven from Welch to hunt, not to leave a stand early, and I am not a man who spooks himself. I left the stand because I wanted to be moving toward camp before full dark. And I am telling you, that was the right call. The woods on the walk back were too quiet. Not the quiet of a cold afternoon, not the wind-off quiet of an overcast evening. The hollow had gone still in that same specific way it had gone still at 2 a.m. the night before, and it was doing it now in daylight, or what was left of it. No chickadees, no wind. The creek was running, but I could hear it only because I was close to it, and the sound of it seemed small and far away under the weight of the silence. I walked faster than I should have on that ground, and I tried not to look toward the laurel thicket. I got back to camp, and Denny was already there, packing his sleeping bag into his duffel. He looked up at me when I came in. He did not say anything right away. I poured coffee and sat on the cooler and waited. "I am going to head home tonight," he said finally. "My back is giving me trouble." His back was fine. We both knew his back was fine. I looked at him and he met my eyes for a second and then he looked at the duffel. "Okay," I said. "You gonna stay?" he asked. There was something in the way he asked it. Not casual. Like the answer mattered more to him than whether I filled my deer tag. "I think so," I said. I do not know why I said that. I have thought about it since. There was something in me that did not want to leave without understanding what I'd seen on that ridge. Some coal miner stubbornness, or just plain pride that did not want to drive home, and with nothing but a story about a shape at a tree line. Denny finished packing. He broke down his stand, loaded it into the truck bed, told me to radio him when I got out the next morning. He drove down the hollow road at about 5:30, and I watched his tail lights disappear around the first curve, and I was alone. I made dinner, a can of soup heated on the propane stove, and sat outside the tent with my rifle across my knees while I ate. The sky had clouded over. No stars. The temperature was dropping, maybe into the mid-teens. The creek was 20 yards away and I could hear it, and I was glad to hear it. I made myself listen to it for a while, just that sound, water on rock. Something normal and present. I went into the tent at 8 and tried to read. I could not read. I lay on my sleeping bag, with my boots still on and the rifle alongside me, and I stared at the tent ceiling and listened. I do not know what time I heard the first sound. I had lost track, and I had not been asleep. It came from the direction of the creek. A single sound, heavy and deliberate, something placing weight on the gravel bank. One footfall, then nothing. I lay still and counted seconds, and at 30 seconds, there was a second footfall, 40 yards maybe, not approaching, not receding, just present. I put my hand on the rifle. I reached up and turned off the battery lantern that had been dimmed down to almost nothing. In the dark, I waited. The footfalls did not continue. For about 5 minutes, there was nothing. Then the smell arrived. I cannot describe it well, and I have tried many times. It was animal, deeply animal, a thick musk that went beyond what I have smelled from bear or from the rut of a deer, something denser and older, and with a secondary note underneath it that I do not have a word for. It was a smell that made the back of my throat constrict. It came through the tent fabric as if the fabric was not there. I unzipped the tent door. I know how that sounds. Every sensible part of me was saying to stay inside, to stay quiet, to wait until morning and then drive home. But the smell was so strong and so present that I needed to see. And there was still enough of the working man in me that not knowing felt worse than seeing. I unzipped the tent slowly, and I stepped out with the rifle up. The cloud cover gave the darkness a faint gray texture, enough to see shapes at 30 or 40 yards if they were large enough to read against the tree line. The creek bed was to my left, and I turned toward it. It was standing in the creek bed, 30 feet. I had 30 feet between me and it, which is the measurement I've carried in my head every day for the past 4 years, and which feels smaller every time I recall it. It was standing on 2 legs in the shallow water of the creek, its back toward me at a slight angle, the way you stand when you are facing something across a creek bed and have become aware of something behind you, but have not yet fully turned. The water was shin deep on it, and on this thing shin deep was higher on the leg than it would be on me. I am going to tell you what I saw in that creek bed in the order that it registered, because that is the only honest way to do it. The height registered first. I am 6 feet even, and I have a working sense of scale from years underground where your headroom matters. This thing stood a clear 2 feet above me, maybe more, and it was not reaching or stretching. It was simply standing. The shoulders were wide, wider than the torso of any man I've known, sloping forward slightly in a way that was not human. The head sat forward on the shoulders rather than above them, a low, heavy carriage, like the way a large dog carries its head when it is watching something. The head was large with a profile that was not human and not any canine I know from these mountains. The ears were high on the skull, pointed, not folded, tracking like a dog's ears track when it is working out a sound. The fur. And I'm calling it fur because I don't know another word for what covered it, was dark and heavy, matted in places, along the shoulders where it was longest, and shorter and coarser along the forearms, which I could see because the forearms were hanging away from the body at a slight outward angle. The hands, if you could call them that, were down at its sides, and they were large. It turned its head toward me. I do not know if it turned because of my movement coming out of the tent or because of some other sense, but it turned slowly and without alarm, which was worse than if it had turned fast. The eyes caught the gray cloud light, a flat yellowish return like the eye shine of a dog in a flashlight beam, and they were set wide in the face with the forward orientation of a predator. It looked at me the way something looks at you when it has already decided what you are and is simply confirming. I did not raise the rifle. I want to be honest about that. The rifle was up as I came out of the tent, and it was pointed at the thing in the creek bed, and I did not fire it. My hands were not shaking, which surprised me later when I thought about it, but I did not fire. The .30 caliber bolt action I carry is a gun I have put through and through a black bear at 40 yards And in that moment, I understood with a certainty I cannot explain that putting a bullet into whatever was standing in that creek would not end the situation. I understood this the way you understand something that your body knows before your brain catches up. I kept the gun up. I kept my eyes on it. I took one step back, slow, the way you back away from something you're not certain about. It watched me take that step. I took another. It did not move from the creek bed. It stood in the water and it watched me with those flat-lit eyes, and it breathed. I could hear its breath now that the hollow had gone fully silent around us. A slow, deep respiration like something that was in no hurry at all. The smell was heavy everywhere. I took a third step back, reached behind me with my left hand, found the tent frame, and kept backing. I backed all the way to the truck, which was parked at the edge of the equipment flat, maybe 40 yards from the tent. I went around to the driver's side door without turning my back to the creek bed. I got in. I locked the door. I sat with the rifle across the seat, and I did not turn on the headlights. For the next 4 hours I sat in that truck. I watched the tent and the creek bed beyond it, and the gray dark between the trees. At some point in the second hour, I heard movement in the laurel thicket on the west side of the hollow, the same thicket where Denny had heard the crashing on the first evening. It was a slow movement this time, not crashing. Deliberate. The sound moved north along the thicket for a while and then stopped. I did not hear it again. A thought came to me in the truck that has not left me in 4 years. The thought was that the hollow had been this hollow before we drove in, and it would be this hollow after we drove out, and the thing in the creek bed was not there because we were there. We were there, and the thing was there, and those were two separate facts that had briefly occupied the same space. There was no malice in it that I could name, and that was its own kind of disturbing. Malice would have meant I was the point. Standing in that creek in the dark, looking at me with those lit eyes, it was simply itself, and I was a man in a tent who had made the mistake of being there. The sky began to gray in the east at about 6:15. Not sunrise, just the first weakening of the dark, the earliest stage of light where you can start to see the shapes of things. I waited until I could see the tent clearly, until I could see the creek bed and confirm it was empty. Then I got out, kept my rifle up, and went to the tent in a straight line. I took my sleeping bag, my pack, my food bag, and the propane stove. I left the wall tent standing because I did not want to spend the time to drop it. I drove down the hollow road with the headlights on and my eyes on the tree line, and I did not stop until I hit the gravel of Route 10 and turned toward Welch. I drove the 12 miles to town without music, without the radio, without anything except the truck noise and the empty road. I pulled into a gas station on the edge of Welch at around 7 in the morning and sat at one of the small tables inside with a large coffee. An older man came in while I was sitting there, a man in his 70s with a McDowell County face, lined and careful, wearing insulated coveralls and carrying a diesel receipt. He looked at me the way people in small towns look at someone who is sitting with 2 hands around a coffee cup and not making conversation. And he sat 2 tables away. After a minute, he said, "You come out of the hollers?" I said, "Yes." "Which one?" I told him Buckhorn Hollow, off Route 10. He looked at his diesel receipt. He folded it once and put it in his chest pocket. He looked at me again, and what was in his face was not disbelief. It was recognition, and it was quiet, and it was the worst thing anyone has said to me about that night, even though he said almost nothing at all. You ought to find somewhere else to hunt, he said. He got up and left without finishing his coffee. His name was Earl. I found that out later from the woman behind the counter who knew him. I never saw him again. I radioed Denny from the gas station parking lot. He picked up on the first call, which told me he had been up, which told me something about how his night had gone in his own house, with his own thoughts. I told him I was out. He said he was glad. I asked him what he had heard the first evening in the Laurel, what exactly it had sounded like to him, and he was quiet for a long moment. Wide, he said. It moved wide. That was all he said about it. We have not talked about Buckhorn Hollow since that morning. Not once, in 4 years, and Denny and I still hunt together every November. We go to a different place. He has never suggested, Buckhorn and I have never suggested it, and neither of us has mentioned it. And in the specific silence between two men who have known each other 20 years, that unspoken agreement is its own kind of confirmation. I have never needed Denny to say what he thinks was in that hollow, because his silence is the only honest account either of us has. I went back to Welch and called no one else. Not the county sheriff, not a wildlife officer, not anyone. I drove home to my house on the east side of town, and I sat in the kitchen for a long time, and I tried to build an explanation the way I had been building them all week, piece by piece, one rational door after another. I tried bear again. I tried transient predator, unknown species, misidentification in the dark and the stress. I tried every door I knew. They all opened to the same room, to a thing standing in a creek at 30 feet with its head turned toward me and its eyes catching the gray cloud light, breathing slowly in a hollow that had gone as quiet as the inside of a mine with the power off. My life is different now in specific ways. I do not go alone into hollow country in the dark anymore. That is the clearest change and also the most practical one. I am not a man who jumped from that night to a framework of belief, to organized thinking about what the thing was or what category it belongs to. I have not joined anything or sought out anything. I have read some accounts that other people have written about encounters in West Virginia. And I can say only that certain details in those accounts are consistent with what I saw. And I will leave it there because I'm not in a position to build a catalog. I have told this story once at a kitchen table, and I am telling it now. And both times I have said the same thing at the end. I am not asking anyone to believe me. I know what I saw. I know what the hollow sounded like at 2 a.m. on a November night with no wind and no water and no insect and no breath of anything living. I know the smell that came through the tent fabric. I know what 30 feet looks like and what a thing looks like at 30 feet when it is 2 feet taller than you and does not startle. What I ask is simpler than belief. All I ask is that if you hunt hollow country in West Virginia or anywhere else where the ridges close in and the laurel runs thick and the creek bottoms go quiet in a way that has weight to it, I ask that you pay attention to the quiet, not the pleasant quiet of a good morning in the woods, the other kind, the kind that sits on you. There is a rifle cartridge in the right-hand pocket of my hunting coat, a .30 caliber unfired from the load I had in the magazine that night. I have run that coat through the wash probably 20 times since November of 2019, and every time I check the pockets before it goes in, and every time I put that cartridge on the shelf above the washer, and every time I put it back. I keep meaning to chamber it or put it away somewhere proper, and I've never done either. It is in the pocket right now.